even a man who knows nothing about women and even less about their underwear understands that the products don't work.
Welcome to the Positive Disruptor series, where I'll be talking to founders and business leaders who are transforming their sector for the better. Today I'm joined by Toby Darbyshire, who is the founder of Heist Studios, the underwear brand that has been borrowing technology from Olympic sportswear and aerospace engineering to revolutionise tights and shapewear. Well, I'd like to start with thanking you, Toby, for making my life a lot easier and making my working day far more comfortable. But for those people who haven't experienced your products or been so exposed to the business, it'd be great if you could talk a little bit about what Heist Studios does.
Well, listen, thank you, and thanks for having me. You kind of covered it pretty well. We look at women's underwear with the same level of engineering and innovation focus that someone like Nike or Adidas bring to sportswear. So we take concepts, materials, technology, pure science that comes from academic institutions, comes, as you said, from aerospace or the Olympics, and we use that to take some pretty humble products such as tights and shapewear, all the way up to sort of much more complex garments like the bra, and look at how we can re-engineer them from the bottom up so that they actually work and are comfortable throughout the day.
Now, the obvious question that I'm dying to ask you is, how did you get into it? It's such a different perspective and approach to the sector.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's the natural question, and I ask it myself a fair amount. And I used to be in solar energy, and my mother still tells everybody I'm in solar energy. So you're not the first person to say, what is this guy, a 39-year-old man talking about women's underwear? We came up with a relatively clear sort of, if you like, sort of the theology behind consumer and how you build meaningful brands that change things for good. And one thing's pretty obvious became pretty obvious is that if you're going to do something that changes in category, you need to find the right category, and that category needs to have two things, I think. One is it needs to have products that aren't very good, because at the core, if you're doing anything with consumer, and whether it's a service or a product, it's the products that deliver that experience. And so you have to be able to bring innovation in a product sense to a category. And secondly, you have to go to a category which just isn't, I don't want to say, it isn't, where there's something meaningful to say. And for my weird journey into women's underwear, started in both cases that whatever the expression, the penny dropped on the tube. The first was when I was walking past an ad which just had three women dressed in sort of full suspenders and tassels and lace, standing in a library. It is unbelievable that ads like that have, with that portrayal of gender, are even like still that like are even effective, but allowed up on the tube. And then the second thing is I was just watching a woman repeatedly pulling up her tights, and she'd put her hand up her skirt and just yank them up. And what occurred to me is that women's underwear is such a broken category that even a man who knows nothing about women and even less about their underwear understands that the products don't work. We just saw an opportunity to approach underwear literally like Nike approached sportswear.
Can we go back to my favourite topic of tights falling down? Because you can see that was close to my heart. But you touched on that as being kind of, I suppose, the catalyst to the business starting. I mean, is that because it was easier to sort of fix that challenge?
If you think about tights and just turn it into like a GCSE physics experiment, the reason tights fall down is really obvious. They do two things if you talk to women. They fall down and they dig in and they're into the waist. And the reason for that's like really simple, because you are knitting a polymer tube, like a really light polymer tube, on a circular knitting machine. So I don't know if you can see my hands, but it literally comes out as a tube. And traditionally, you take these two very light tubes and you sew them together, and then you put a really heavy seam and a gusset in between. They're quite high tech when you get into the sort of polymer science around the yarns and how you make them. But one thing that they don't do, they're really good at covering legs and really bad at making comfortable waistbands. So you have the squeeze and then you have these tights falling down. And so of course women hate them. But if you look at those as like literally just engineering problems, it becomes really easy to think through. So what we figured out is that you can remove gravitational pull by, instead of having two tubes and sewing them together, you have a single tube, which you actually use a laser to cut at the top, and then essentially this tube gets bent down into two legs. And that means there is no gravitational pull on the gusset, so it just won't fall down. There are some fundamental problems there that you can solve really simply. And actually, the technology to solve them is quite non-trivial. It's actually like a really complex piece of work. There's a lot of data that goes into, and there's a lot of manufacturing complexity. And we have a patent for a bra that will look broadly similar to a normal bra, but it's fundamentally built in a totally different way. And we've done 3 years of pure science with academic partners. We've pioneered the same lasers that Airbus use to measure whether they have non-visible sort of essentially fractures at the particle level on aircraft wings to understand why a bra becomes more uncomfortable over the course of a day.
When I'm listening to you, Toby, it's so interesting to see, how you've really positively disrupted a sector that needed disrupting. And I think as women, we took it for granted that things like our tights are uncomfortable. So it made me think that when I think about your business, I would imagine the team behind it looks very different to a traditional fashion business or just, even an underwear business, because what you're doing and the approach you've taken is so different. I'd love to understand a bit more about the team behind Heist Studios.
We tend to take people who either have come from totally different backgrounds, but just have that DNA, that we call it subversive, but that desire to sort of like positively disrupt, to sort of turn things around, rip it up a bit, to sort of change. But there's, we look for sort of very bright people with the right DNA, and as a result, we've got like a lot more science sort of focus, a lot more sort of modern sort of digital focus, and then a lot, and that's quite sort of like the tech mindset, the sort of startup mindset is really strong, and collectively that's great because we trade off on like having done it all before somewhere comparable, but so we have to learn a bit more. But the flip side is when we do things, they tend to be a bit different and a little bit more exciting than we would have done if we just copied a playbook.
And how do you get the balance of obviously the big investment in innovation R&D, which I imagine is quite different in your company versus other companies, versus kind of spending the focus on retail and selling products? What does that balance look like?
So I think we kind of go in waves, and we tend to sort of invest very, very heavily in projects that deliver specific launch products. And then try to be a bit more commercial, a bit more pragmatic when we look at sort of, the stage after that, and then diffusing that out into a series of categories. Sometimes you kind of just have to sort of take a hit. You've just got to sort of spend and just trust yourself that actually that will deliver something like game changing, and it will deliver something game changing for the consumers, most importantly, and that will like ladder up into business success, and hope that you're just not, because obviously our competitors aren't spending any of that money, so you kind of got to just hope that capital allocation risk works. But that's if we're talking, that's the big risk of Heist. A lot of money went into some complex R&D that nobody else in our industry touches, and we're thankfully we're alive as a result of it, and sort of kicking as a result of it. But that's the big play with us, and we're going to have to wait and see, I think. But it feels like the right thing to be doing.
But again, I think this is a common theme I'm hearing interviewing people like yourself, where I think there's two words that really come to mind here is agility and bravery. I think people that are genuinely disrupting their space for the better, you have to have those two approaches. Otherwise, to your point, that you wouldn't invest so much on innovation because it's a brave thing to do, as opposed to just focus on the commercials day to day. So I think, I'd say congratulations for taking that approach, because I think it's businesses like yours that take this approach that end up with really genuinely adding so much value to the end consumer. And I think to your point earlier, that's what us customers want in today's world.
you wouldn't set up a business if you weren't a little bit stupid, right? I mean, there are definitely safer ways to earn a salary and more structural like ways to stuff, especially if you have kids and things. So I kind of feel that there's like a part of it is just sort of, it's also kind of in your DNA to sort of to take the riskier path when more sensible, more like everybody else would do something else. And you like that's one that consistently is probably the wrong thing to do if you were going to look at anything rationally. But if you were completely rational, then you wouldn't be doing this in the first place. So
your first shapewear line that you launched, I understand that you launched it with an all-female team. I'd love to again understand, how does that influence the design process, and the end product?
So our innovation team is called Lab 12, and we do this process called Collab 12, where we bring, some cases, thousands of customers into the product development process. And I think in part of that, it's not so much from the technology side, because that's us, or from the design side, although we get a huge amount of feedback that's super useful, but more for this trying to understand the female body in a sort of more meaningful way. And like in a sort of, if we're being really honest, trying to understand how our products work on women. Bodies are very different. And our products are, it's actually understanding how things work on people and how the products, how they live with the products is like, it's the hardest challenge for anybody in underwear. So we ended up just saying, listen, all of this, it's very easy to say that it's like an all-female cast, and then we use, in inverted commas, real women, which means that we do fit models, but actually like all women are real. What you really need to do is build a data set and actually understand how a product works when 100, 200, 1,000 people are putting it on and saying, this is comfortable, this leg aperture doesn't work for me, this is, my like, it's really basic, my torso height doesn't work for this product. And so we try and build as meaningful a data set as we can through this level of engagement. And the good thing for our customers is that they love it, because if these are products that answer problems for them, and we're saying, like, don't just buy something from us, come and help us solve your issue. And we love it because we get this opportunity to just engage with women in quite sort of, like in some cases, like, some quite material detail about their bodies and how things work and don't work.
What's interesting is that you're not just disrupting in terms of the innovation into the products, but actually the way you're actually marketing your product and the business. I mean, why is that so important to take such a different stance to, I suppose, what other companies do in the sector?
Well, so we call it subversive, but what you would probably call positive disruption. But so this idea of subversion and it being like part of the DNA at Heist, we just thought, like, rather than just do the traditional here, why don't we just buy a bunch of huge billboards and then just put up the words, is shapewear anti-feminist? That question mark. And just, let that debate tinker around, because clearly shapewear is one of these things which comes with sort of a whole bunch of societal sort of discussion around it. And it's very easy just to try and sort of sidestep that and be very standard and just take it to market as if it's another product. And we thought, listen, well, why don't we just engage that conversation? And we don't always get it right, and we don't always sort of, I think we try and do this, and occasionally, we probably are not as like clever or disruptive as we'd like to be. But I think this idea that sort of, if you're going to be different in the way you make products, you should also try and think about being different in the way you take it to market and the way you talk to your customers. And like that concept of like being different actually is what makes Heist interesting.
Having spoken to a lot of positive disruptors now in this series, it's interesting that, a few of them, I would say, have accidentally disrupted their space. But with you, Toby, it seems like that may be a bit of a motivation given your previous business and now what you're doing at Heist Studios. So is that the motivation for you?
We all get our motivation from different areas. I think for me, it's about just doing something where you can look back and say that wasn't standard, right? Like, that we moved the dial, and that because otherwise, for me, I'm just selling time. It's like, all these direct consumer companies, it's a bit like a return to being sort of Victorian shopkeepers, all these people, great degrees and amazing employment, and then we all start selling tights or some vegetables in boxes or whatever it is. I think you've got to be able to wake up, or at least for me, it's important to be able to wake up in the morning and say, like, there's actually behind the fact that I'm in the rag trade, flogging pants, is actually like something that will potentially just leave, in a very small way, like society a little bit better off, or a group of consumers a little bit better off than before we started. And I think, to your point, your phrase, positive disruption, right? And I kind of, if you're going to make change, it's going to be beneficial. It kind of, you do have to shake things up a little bit. Otherwise, you're just adding to yet another door where people can buy the same product.
Interesting. As the business scales and it becomes more successful, does it become harder to be kind of braver and take risks? I mean, I'm always fascinated by that dynamic.
This is one that I'm sure that you probably have a pretty good lens on as well. I think that there are subtle shifts in team as well that happen at scale, that just do change the way you think about business. As you scale, the organization just moves with you, and so that it's not so much a balancing. It's definitely not about trying to force people to be brave, because you get a bigger organization, you want stuff like more organizational controls. Like, those are really critical when you're not three people around a desk. But you do need to sort of ensure that DNA of being like that your DNA is there. So we have this thing of being subversive, empathetic, and integrous. These are like fundamentally important. And so you don't want to turn that off because you want to become a better business, but you do need to try and make sure that the initial spirit doesn't get washed over as you become more corporate.
I can't believe that we've spoken for this amount of time and we haven't touched on COVID. I know the business is direct to consumer, but I'd love to understand if any kind of you've seen changes in your customer base in terms of their habits during COVID.
We've seen some very clear impacts, but I think we have this huge benefit of not having 10,000 of our own stores dotted around the world, because that really would be difficult right now. And our e-com business continues to thrive. This is the period where hospitality retail makes its money. I mean, Cyber Week, Christmas. So I think we're sort of optimistic about where we are as a business. We've done a huge amount to like solidify and structurally support ourselves. So we're not short-term worried. We are long-term cautious about what the trajectory looks like over the next 6 to 12 months.
But I think I hope you take comfort in, having spoken with you today, that, your business sounds like you are really set up to be agile and react to whatever's coming. So I'm going to say you should be cautiously very optimistic. I'd love to end with you, Toby, just giving some advice to future positive disruptors, because like I said, you've done it before, you're doing it again. What advice would you give to someone starting out?
So I meet quite a lot of like young entrepreneurs who are still being quite theoretical about what they're doing, particularly if you're leaving, really well-paid jobs or whatever. I totally understand the point. I think that my advice to them always is pretty similar, which is just basically like, just go and do it. Like, it doesn't take 2 years to set up an underwear brand. I mean, you can literally get out, so it takes some time, like, clearly, but you can go out and you can just try it. And a lot of people spend a lot of time thinking about whether they should do something. And actually, I don't think there's ever a theoretical answer. Like, it could work, it could not work. It's always a bit embarrassing if you tell your friends you have an idea and it's going to make you a millionaire and it doesn't. I mean, like, sure, but like, actually the best thing you can do is just, if you think the idea is great, just go and try it. And you'll soon see whether you were right or wrong. And more likely what you'll find out is that you kind of don't really know after the first year, but there are some directional pointers. And that's kind of where you end up staying for the rest of your life. Like, nobody ever really like makes it. There's always challenges one way or the other, like around the corner. But my advice is just, don't overthink it. Just try. The single thing that determines whether you're going to be a good entrepreneur, and that as well as like a happy one, not just like a good one, is your ability to bounce back. He's like, resilience is all that matters. You will create and go through and like this up and down, and the peaks and troughs will be brutal. Your challenge is how do you speed up recovery from the lowest point of the trough?
I couldn't agree more. All that's left to say is a huge thank you to you, Toby, from one of your customers, but clearly for giving us your time and being so honest. My ask of you is to keep fighting, because we need entrepreneurs who genuinely are positively disrupting and adding to your customers in such a positive way. It's interesting you end on the word resilience. I recently did an interview, and that was a theme of it for me, was resilience. And I think more than ever in the middle of a pandemic, whatever you're doing, you need resilience, but more so I think when you are an entrepreneur who's absolutely going into your sector and positively disrupting it. So a huge thank you. Thank you for everyone who is watching. Really appreciate you tuning in, and we will see you soon.